Well, today we're talking to Molly from where I've forgotten where you're at. Wow, is it whereabouts are you just now, Molly?
So I'm in a place called Alon Shvut, which is just south of Jerusalem in
Oh,
Israel.
that's right. It's Israel, isn't it? Yeah, I knew it was
Yes.
going to be an interesting talk today.
Yes.
Absolutely. Now, you
Yes.
don't sound like a native of Israel to me.
That is correct. I was born actually in Connecticut. I spent most of my life in New York, and I moved to Israel in 1994. So
Oh,
I've been
wow.
here
So you've
quite a
been
while.
there for quick calculation, 24 years.
That's right. That's right.
Wow. So,
hmm
so how have you adapted to Israeli culture?
Really well. I mean, it was quite shocking when I realized that I had lived in Israel more years than I had lived in the States because always considered myself an immigrant for so long. But really, thank God, very happy here, raising my children here. My children consider themselves fully Israeli culturally, and it's a very warm culture overall. So
How have you
we're very
managed with the
happy.
language?
Oh, so that's a good question. The truth is that I always had religious studies in Hebrew, and so I had Hebrew as a language for in school for quite a while. That doesn't mean it was simple when I came. And again, that was one of those things that also, like when I started to realize that I was almost fluent, I was quite surprised. I remember when I came and I couldn't understand the news, and then a few years later, it was obvious that I understood the news on the radio or on the television, and then I realized that I had acclimated.
Just kind of
Um,
creeped up on you.
yeah, and also there are a lot of there's a lot of English speaking people in Israel, so it's not at such a it's not like immersing, like being thrown completely into
Mm.
a culture. You have a lot of buffer, I would say.
So you could read and write Hebrew already when you arrived then?
Yes, I could read and write Hebrew when I got here,
Yeah.
and then the more I was here, the more it became part of my language. And I'd say now, like my life is basically pretty bilingual.
Yeah. I must say in Israel, I mean, I speak virtually no Hebrew. Well, don't speak any Hebrew, but
Yeah,
I mean, English seems to get by pretty well most
yeah,
places.
yeah. Well, I'd say all the signs are Hebrew, English, Arabic. Everything is, I'd say, all Hebrew, Arabic, English, because
Yeah.
it should be third, but it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's very, and most people know you learn Hebrew, you learn English in school. You're expected to be able to study in university in English, and so it's very easy to get along here in English
Right.
with
Wow.
English.
Yeah.
It's not a country
So
that's you
kids are
know
kids are bilingual, presumably
kids are
then.
bilingual, and it's actually known that if a parent is an English speaker, it's a tremendous advantage. They all try to speak to their children in English so that the kids will have that advantage because they're so aware of how
Yeah.
helpful it is
Yeah.
to
So
have
it's
it.
fair to say that you understand Israeli culture and what's going on in the news at the moment. And
Yes, yes. At
yeah.
this point, yes,
So
absolutely.
how has your 2020 been? Is an interesting question.
Right, that's the big question for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have to say, well, how's my 2020 been? Well, I'd say thanks to you, I have been concerned about this pandemic since the very beginning of 2020, already by,
Since January, yeah.
January,
Yeah.
early February. I was closely monitoring it also because my father lives in the States. And so travel was a big deal for me. We
Mm.
were planning on going, and when I started realizing there was a world pandemic, I started getting a little concerned about that. So it basically, I would say I was aware of this before most people. I was one of those who I made my husband stock up on a month of groceries before anybody else had stocked up on the groceries. We were those
Yeah.
people.
Mm.
Um, I would say that in the context of Israel, it was actually very interesting because I think Israel did a very good job handling this pandemic overall. And so it was like I was maybe at the beginning a couple of weeks ahead, 3 days ahead. Um, there's a holiday called Purim, which is a very social public day. I was already aware on Purim. I didn't let anybody into my house. I didn't go out.
What date's that, Molly?
What day is that? It's a festival. I think this year it was on. I can tell you exactly the date. If I can remember it. I'm not gonna if I can remember it. March? Is it possible that it was in March?
Early,
9th. It's a celebration. It's like
March,
of these
yeah.
holidays. Yeah. But it's very festive. Everybody dresses up in costumes. You eat meals with your friends and family. You deliver food packages. Again, and in our community, there's a public festival in the streets with singing and dancing. And I think 2 days later was when people became very aware that this issue was serious. Until then, I think the restrictions were more people who had been to countries with people who had been to New York, people who had been to certain European countries were meant to quarantine when they came back for 2 weeks. I'm trying to remember if there were any other restrictions at the time. Maybe they started restricting gatherings to like 100 people, But then pretty soon after Purim, I think it was, they put some the more serious restrictions in. School was closed down, distance learning. Encouraging people. There were very strict rules about going to work. Most work was from home, besides essential workers, and companies had very strict rules about how many people were allowed to work at a time. And then from then, I would say March through April, the restrictions got more, I would say put in place very well.
More severe restrictions.
More severe, yeah.
So Purim sounds great fun, but it sounds like it's a time of social mixing, as we remember.
Yes.
We remember the triumph of Esther, don't we?
Exactly. That's right. So I think exactly. I think the social mixing on Purim, it was like just when it was starting to become in the public awareness, and it was. My guess is, I don't know. We'd have to go back and check, all those fun charts, whether that actually caused a spike. But then already by Passover, which is 1 month after Purim, which is why it's easy to chart these things for the holidays.
Yeah.
They were which is also, it might even be more social than Purim in the sense, or more tricky for coronavirus in the sense that the Passover Seder, the evening meal, is a traditionally family time. Everybody goes to their grandparents and parents, and 4 or 5 generations will sit at the table together. And so the government made it very clear, not this Passover. Take care of your parents, take care of your grandparents, stay home. There was, a very big drive to make sure that people who were going to be alone had whatever they needed. There was a lot of talk about how you could do things over Zoom, social media, to maintain connection that way. But already by Passover, I think even there was I think that they never were full lockdowns where you couldn't travel the roads, because there were always exceptions. You were allowed to go buy essential food and drugs, medicines. But the day of Passover, I think the first day and the last day, which in Sephardic custom is also a very social day, those days they actually put lockdowns on travel because they didn't want to see spikes, because they knew that those days were days that had potential for a lot of mixing. Yeah.
I think for the Israeli government to say that Passover's cancelled this year is about as big a cultural imposition as it's possible to make. It's just like saying, right, scrub the culture that we've had for the last 3,000 years. It's off this year.
Right. So what was beautiful is that that's not what they said. They said it in a really nice way.
Okay.
And I think no, it's a great way to say it, because they could have said that, but they didn't. And I think that was part of why overall Israel's had a very, very successful until now. Now we're reopening, and with the reopening, our numbers are going up. But again, we had a large number of cases, but our death rate has been pretty low. We've really managed. Yeah, it's been. I think it's hovering around 300.
7, I think, today.
Yeah, and over 20,000 cases overall. So that's pretty good, I would say. We handled it really well, and I think Passover is a good example of how they did that, because from the very beginning, anytime they had to put in restrictions, whether it was explaining social distancing, telling people not to visit their parents or their grandparents, encouraging wearing of masks. The government was very, very clear about what you had to do and why, and what the reasons were. So even from the very first time, I remember that there was a press conference about it. They made it very clear. They said, you're doing this for the sake of your parents and your grandparents. that's why we're asking you all to do this, which was something that the people could really understand. Another example for Passover was the week leading up to Passover. There were phone calls made by all the social services they would trace. They also, by the way, tracing reminds me, they did very good contact tracing, certainly at the beginning. They had all that like app stuff, which was another, the contact trace, isolate was very much in place. But sorry, back to my Passover example. The week before Passover, they contacted every person who was, I forgot what age it was, but over a certain age, was contacted by somebody in social services. Often it was young volunteers, and they were asked if they had everything they needed, and they were brought over an entire package for a Passover Seder. The Ministry of Health actually put out a call that said, everybody's going to be doing Passover. You're just going to be doing it in your nuclear families. 8:30 at night, they said, everybody go out, and we're all going to sing one of the traditional Passover songs together from the balconies.
Right. Right, okay.
So everybody did that. And I think what ended up happening was that people who were used to these giant seders, these giant meals with 20 people at the table, perhaps more, were now doing it with themselves, in their nuclear families. And for the people who were isolated, it was really hard. I think they were seen as very heroic, and there was a lot of empathy for them. But for intact nuclear family, I mean, all families are intact, but I'm saying for people who are in their nuclear families where there were maybe 3 or 4 people or 6 or whatever it was, they ended up saying, wow, we really enjoyed the Seder this year because you had smaller groups and you really got to have conversations with your kids. And so it didn't end up feeling like it was canceled. It felt like it was different.
And I think it made it a very positive message rather than saying, so you're now doing this in this nice new way rather than we're not letting you do this anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And we're aware of the difficulties. It was really very much like a call. The country was called to service almost. That was the way it was sent. That was where the message was sent, and I think that's kind of why it worked overall.
And was there political unity in this?
Yeah, that was quite interesting. As opposed to other countries where there was a very strong political, there was a very strong sense of political divide. Very little of that here. You had a few voices, because you're always going to have a few voices, but overall, they didn't feel that way. It really felt like people got that this was not about politics at all. This was about health. This was about national health, and this was about taking care of each other, taking care of ourselves and each other. And so we didn't have those types of tensions. Right. That wasn't the feeling.
And so how were these public health messages communicated to the public?
Yeah, so that was also quite interesting. Again, we're a pretty techie country, so first of all, there was, besides the fact that it was basically communicated by every time there was a new change in the restrictions, there was the news would always tell you, tonight, so the Prime Minister and the Minister of Health and the Deputy Minister are going to get up and tell you. But for example, I very quickly downloaded an app put out by the Ministry of Health, and it was so clear, and everything was communicated on that. Everything with like your infographics that are so helpful to people. So they had a lot of those infographics. They would give out every day how many cases, how many critical, how many serious, how many people on respirators, how many deaths, where things were. And what I found actually interesting was in the beginning they had to figure out how to give over the information in culturally appropriate ways, and that they did very too. Communities that don't have that much social media, they had to, let's say, in the ultra-Orthodox community where they're not so into technology because they want to keep more insulated. So they did what's done in those communities. They have cars going down the streets with loudspeakers. So they sent cars down, and it took a while I think in certain Arab populations, in certain communities, everything was very quickly, which I thought was actually very lovely, very quick. Whenever there was those infographics, it was sent out in Arabic, English, Russian, and Amharic, which is the Ethiopian language, really to make sure that every community could hear the necessary information. And I think there was a lot of awareness of how to culturally give over the information appropriately. And I think in every community, they tried to figure out what was the most culturally appropriate way to give over the information, and it worked. And some communities lagged a little bit, but once they got on board, once they recognized the seriousness, everybody eventually figured it out.
I think people often don't realize from outside just how multicultural a society Israel is. I mean, you mentioned there the Amharic people from Ethiopia.
Yeah, yeah.
And their dark skin groupings.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned there's again I think a lot of people don't appreciate there's quite a substantial Arabic population
absolutely.
who are citizens of Israel.
Yes, yes, there are Arab Israeli citizens. Absolutely.
And then you've got what you might call the mainstream. I don't know what you call them, the mainstream people. But then you've got this ultra Orthodox community as well.
Correct.
And you have their own lifestyle with their own culture.
Yes, it's all very interesting. And you have people from the European countries, and you have people from the what are called the Sephardic countries, which are the more we're talking about Spain and Tunisia and Africa and Yemen. It's a whole different culture than the European culture, and
massively,
and
the Russian culture as well. I mean, there's quite a few Russian people.
It was a giant influx of Russians that came mostly in the 80s, but they're still coming. There was a large, the Russian population, and every culture brings its own contribution to the country, which I think is lovely,
Actually, I mean, it must be probably the most multicultural country in the world, actually, probably. when you think about it in those terms.
Yeah, I never thought about it, as you say, in those terms. But it is extremely multicultural. It is.
And again, the wide variety of languages was reflected in the public health information messages. Yeah,
for sure.
Now, and when the message kind of got through, did people accept this as necessary? Were people kind of won over to the philosophy of what was required?
I think so, because I think it was framed really well. It was framed well. First of all, the message was clear. The information was clear. Again, I think that there was all of the real public health message. Who's sick? How many people are sick? It explained also how you can't necessarily, the asymptomatic nature of it, what the symptoms were. It was all very clearly expressed. And again, I think the message was from the very beginning, we're taking care of each other, which I think is a great way to get people on board, right? Meaning you're doing this, and again, because you have a country where there is a lot of emphasis on family, it's not hard to tell people you're doing this for your grandparents. People will even the youth. Now, again, I'm not saying everything is beautiful and perfect, right? It's certainly, let's say, it's mask wearing. Right now, again, now that we've reopened, our numbers are, again, as I said, going up. And there is a challenge at this point to get people to comply with masks. I think now they're starting to crack down in terms of legal, right? There, you can be arrested, but like the youth, it's harder to get the youth to wear masks. But when they're reminded, again, you're doing this for your parents and your grandparents, that's something that that's a language that they can that can resonate with them.
Yeah.
So
one of the things I find fascinating that's come out of this pandemic and the responses to it is the way that culture has influenced behavior. So for example, in Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, China, there's a culture of mask wearing all the time, and strangely enough, these countries have done fairly well.
Right. Surprisingly, shockingly.
Like in the UK, it's only bank robbers wear masks. It's just not part of the culture. Now, it is coming now. It's definitely coming now, and it's mandated on public transport. But it's
mandated only on public transport in England?
It's only mandated on public transport at the moment. It's not mandated in supermarkets. So it's a condition of travel on all forms of public transport. But that's not taking anything like far enough, in my view.
Yeah.
I feel all public areas should wear masks.
Right. So here, that's the rule. That in Israel, it's if you're in a public space, you have to be wearing a mask. And again, it's not always Yeah, it's not always complied with, again, but that's officially the rule. And I think there's a reasonable degree of compliance, I would say. Yeah.
And the lag has been incredible. I mean, the research for this was done in the States, and to me, it was clear from March.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just by reading a few research papers.
That's right.
And now it's March, April, May, June, and 3 months later, the British government are kind of getting around to the idea.
Yeah.
But the reason I think it's so delayed is because it's going against cultural norms.
Mm-hmm.
So we had examples in Malaysia. I don't want to pick out any particular grouping, but in Malaysia, for example, there was large religious gatherings,
right,
that caused problems.
Right.
And again, in some places in the United States, there was, and of course, the original epicenter in South Korea was at a religious stroke sect, whatever it was, grouping. So what's happening with worship services in synagogues at the moment in Israel?
Yeah, so that's a great question. By the way, also here, I think they only started mandating masks mid-April, which is interesting.
Yeah, well, it's a lot earlier than us.
Yeah.
2 months.
Yeah. I feel like just in terms of that question, I feel like it's like they're saying masks, hygiene, social distancing, and being outside. And I don't know if everybody's keeping all 4 of those, or they usually say 3, but I think of it as 4. But I think enough people are keeping like a few, so maybe they're not wearing masks, but they're 2 meters and they're outside. So those kind,
which is fine. I mean, mask wearing is for indoors, really.
Yeah.
Outdoors, not as much of a problem.
Right. So in schools, there's no way they're 2 meters apart, but they're officially at least supposed to be wearing masks. So I find that interesting. Now, I'm sorry to, now to come back to what you just asked.
No, it's fine. Fine.
Yeah. The religious gathering has been an issue. At a certain point, it was interesting. At a certain point when they closed and they said you can only gather outside a certain amount of people, this was outside, the number they chose was 10, which is not coincidence because that's a quorum of men for a religious service in Jewish law. A quorum
of people
to be 10.
You need 10 men.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
And they closed the synagogues, and at a certain point they said, no services. And I think you're right. I checked because I was interested because to see whether this was true also in the Arab population was the same thing. They closed the mosques when they closed the synagogues. And again, I think for many people, that was one of the hardest things, as you said, in terms of culture. That was one of the hardest things for people to let go of, was synagogue and worship. And I imagine that's again cross-cultural in all the all the religions in Israel. It was very hard for people. And then there were questions again. If we do it outside and we're all in our balconies or in our backyards, would that be okay? And it was kind of this gray area, and there was a lot of question about that. We have actually in our backyard have had religious services, even though they have allowed going back to synagogue at this point with certain rules, only a certain amount of people and with social distancing. But I think people feel like, why take the risk if we can just hang out in our yards?
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that. So for a synagogue service, you need a minimum of 10 men or 11 men. Is that?
Yeah, 10 men. I mean, again, it depends on your denomination. For some, it's
I wasn't aware of that. Right, interesting.
Yeah, but for Orthodox services, it's 10 men. Yeah.
No, I mean, my church has been closed for months now, and it's still closed. And I think churches are open for private prayer in the UK now, but not for groups.
Yeah.
But, I did make sort of some criticism about some sort of fundamentalist groups who were carrying on meeting in the States, for example, and
Right.
It's just
so that was also here. There was an issue where it's very hard. People who are religious, it's very hard to let go. But I think it became an issue of awareness.
Yeah,
like communities.
The thing is, it's not about me getting infected. It's about what I'm going to infect other people. This is about.
That's right.
This is all about altruism, And I think if you frame it in that terms, then most.
Yeah. And I think when people started seeing, that let's say communities in the States. Because it really, and they also, I think, when they started coming out with studies that were showing that synagogue is a place of houses of worship are a place of spread, people really started taking that seriously. So,
but again, it's an example of how it's an example of how culture has been subjugated to the scientific needs of the virus, which is part of the reason for Israel's success.
Yeah, but again, I think part of what's I think the places that have done it more successfully have figured out how to find a good interplay between respecting the culture and respecting the virus, because both of those very much need to be respected.
Absolutely, as was done in Passover, as in the example you gave, which is a successful example of that.
Yeah.
What is the testing situation like in Israel? And is that related to individual sort of isolations and?
Yeah. So the truth is, I think we've been.
Oh no, we're frozen up.
Oh, I lost you for a second.
I think we just froze up. Just ignore it. Just carry on.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. All right, so at least you can hear me. You could get a test. I think for a while you needed to have symptoms to get a test, like either a cough or a fever, or you had been in contact with a person who had known. Right now, I think part of the opening up strategy, my impression, and again, I don't know this for sure. This is just my layman's impression. My layman's impression is that they're moving to a model now that they're opening more. They're easing restrictions on testing, like they're allowing people to get tested, with an easy. I forgot even if there needs to be criterion for request, because schools are now reopened, and because people are going back to work, and malls are now reopening, and almost everything is basically opening at this point. Right. But their argument is we're gonna increase testing so that we can have that awareness, and we can know where the cases are. So testing is I can't tell you it's great, because I don't know that it's great, but I think we're okay when it comes to testing. I think people can complain
if someone does test positive, they have to write
their answers.
Sorry. I was thinking, if someone does test positive, is the message clear that they would have to isolate for 14 days?
Absolutely. That was from the very beginning. If you test positive, or if you, that was even before these lockdown measures, if you had been in contact with somebody who tested positive, you had to go into quarantine for 14 days. My daughter actually had to do that, because it had turned out that in her school, somebody had tested positive, and this was early. This was before Passover even, and so she was down in the basement. It didn't have to be 14 days. It was 14 days from time of contact, but she was down there for a good 6 days, and that they took very seriously. Anybody who had been there was any type of potential, if they had been in contact with an infected person, went into quarantine. If you're positive, absolutely you're quarantined for 14 days. They also set up these quarantine hotels. I think you had a choice of isolating at home or going to these hotels. I think the healthcare has also been, again, we had that advantage of being ahead, and unfortunately seeing what was going on in Europe, and so I think they could prepare, and because of that, I think the care has also been good.
There was a bit of time in hand, absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, in Israel, what is the culture for sunbathing?
That's right. So absolutely. So I would say that there has been critique of what's going on at the beaches. It's summer now. It's beach time. People are going. I don't know. The truth is, I don't know, because being a person who follows this carefully, I'm not running out of my house, so I haven't really been to the beaches. But my impression is that, it depends. Are you asking, are people getting their vitamin D, or are you asking, are people going out and not social distancing? Yeah. So again, the official rule is you've got to have your mask on. You've got to be two meters away from each other. I'm sure that was not always kept at the beaches. I don't know. I can't say, because I haven't been out too much. But in terms of vitamin D, there's a very strong sun here, and people are out and they exercise a lot. It is a pretty, I would say, I don't know if it's an outside climate or sporty culture, but I feel like, from that perspective, I think that's actually a good thing. I think people are getting their vitamin D.
It wouldn't take us long in the Israeli sun to get.
Yeah, it's a hot sun. We're close to the equator. So
absolutely, yeah. I mean, I suppose partly what I'm asking is how acceptable, for example, is it for men to wear shorts or to cover themselves up?
Oh, yeah. You know, also interestingly, you talk about culture, like it's such a small country, but the culture of Jerusalem and the culture of Tel Aviv are very, very different cultures, because Jerusalem is a much more classically religious city,
right,
and Tel Aviv is a much more secular city. So if you walk around certain areas of Jerusalem, you'll see, and again, this is true of Arabs and of Jews, covered to the, you know, up men, women, children, right? There's a culture of being very dressed. Go to Tel Aviv, you know, it's all shorts, bikinis, bathing suits. It's really a party city in a positive way. It's actually, you know,
yeah.
So there's no lack of people with their bodies exposed to the sun. Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely. But there is a substantial religious minority, whether it's Islamic or Jewish.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to think.
Christian groups who do cover themselves. Yeah. So presumably their vitamin D levels could be quite low.
That's a good point. I'm not. Yeah. Listen. I know that there are people taking vitamin D drops, you know, to make up for it. It's also a good question. Like, if you're
a fascinating study.
It would be.
Vitamin D levels between
religious cultures.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's an interesting.
And the other one is the Amharics, of course, are quite dark coloured, aren't they?
Yes, and that's actually quite interesting, because it's not. I don't have a sense that, like, you know, we have this, you know, that you follow very closely, that in certain communities, people with darker skin are more susceptible. We haven't seen that data here. We haven't seen that Ethiopians are disproportionately affected. It could be that we just don't have the data, but
do Ethiopians tend to have outside jobs?
Mm-hmm. And
do Ethiopians tend to work outside?
It's an interesting question. I don't know how their work demographic would break up with other demographics.
Interesting, because, for example, if you compare the data in Sweden, where there's a Somali population, they've got way more cases, way more complications.
Yeah.
If you compare black people in the United States, they've got way more cases. If you compare black and Asian people, and when we say Asian in the UK, we normally mean South Asian, so Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi. Yeah. Again, that they've got significantly more severe cases and significantly more deaths.
Yeah.
So it would be fascinating to compare Amharic Israelis with, say, American origin Israelis.
Right, and we haven't seen any of those studies. That's quite interesting. I think for us, it was quite sad at the beginning, because, again, the population was the elderly, and we have a lot of Holocaust survivors, and so to lose Holocaust survivors to Corona was quite sad.
Wow.
But besides that, we haven't. And again, the elderly population is what we've been seeing. We haven't seen any other substrata that's not at least the message that we've been seeing. It would be interesting later to see any kind of data analysis, but I'm hopeful that the fact that we aren't seeing that is a sign that there isn't a greater death rate among.
Interesting. There's a few PhDs in epidemiology there if someone wants to do the studies.
Yeah.
It's sad that, I mean, of course, the Holocaust survivors, we're losing that generation now. And when I was a young staff nurse, I worked with quite a few. That, you know, in the 80s, they were coming in. They were in the 60s then, and some pretty interesting people to meet. It was I just wish I'd sort of sat there taking notes or recording conversations now, because, you know, from the UK, that generation's basically gone now, and.
Right.
But it wasn't uncommon, you know, people from the Holocaust, people from Stalin's gulags.
Right.
Yeah, we came across all those in the 80s and 90s, but sadly not so much anymore.
That's right.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Now, this app, is it like a geolocation app? Have people accepted it?
Oh, yes. Yeah. The truth is, also, I think so. I again, like, a lot of the issues that are very political in other places are less here. I'm not hearing a lot of talk about it. I think some people who have downloaded it are like, oh, that's helpful. It also tells you where around you people are sick. So people are like, oh, that's great.
Makes perfect sense to me.
So there isn't a lot. Yeah, there isn't a lot of public. I mean, I want to say none. I remember when they said that they were doing it, they said we're doing this. We're taking, you know, we're tracking your phones, not just the app, but like we're tracking your your movement through your phone, so that if you're positive, we can tell people where you've been. And we're going to erase the data when it becomes no longer necessary. Like they were very clear in saying this is an emergency measure. They might have even taken it to the Supreme Court to see if it was legal. I don't even remember, but they did something. And there were a few people who were like, "Oh gosh, this is a slippery slope," but it didn't balloon into a very large public conversation. And again, I think it's because people, the virus wasn't politicized here, which I think is good.
I think if Israeli culture can accept that kind of app, it's a rather sad reflection that other cultures can't.
Right.
I mean, I probably get more hate mail about that than anything else. I'm not having this app, I mean, people really, I'm not watching your videos anymore. You said that was a good idea. Really, and much stronger reactions than that.
Yeah.
Real, what I would consider paranoia.
Yeah.
I'll get hate mail about this. How dare you say I'm paranoid when this is a real risk? It's
right. How could I let anybody have my information? Yeah, I do think that it has to do with trust. That there was a sense. Again, I think as I said, I think things are changing now with the opening and the numbers going up. People are, and again, possibly in a positive way because the death rates are low. People are starting to lose a little bit. It's like it's a little bit more of a free-for-all feeling. But certainly in the beginning, there was very much of a sense of trust, and therefore it wasn't like, oh yeah, this is an opportunity to take away my civil liberties. That wasn't really.
Well, that's great. That's great. So things are opening up now. There's quite significant opening up. So what I would expect that means is I expect there will be more cases.
Yeah, which there have been.
I think that's fairly inevitable because this virus has not gone away. Mm-hmm. But what I'm hoping, actually, as in the UK, rather than getting another peak, we're just going to carry on getting a sprinkling of cases.
Right.
And I think that'll happen all the way through till winter.
Yeah. So we have now, at our lowest, we were at single digits, tens, well, maybe some point single digits, but then 10s and 20s, and everybody was so happy. And I wonder, had we stayed closed down a little longer, could we have been New Zealand? But I don't know if that's realistic.
Yeah.
And back to I'd say 200, 300 a day. I hope with you that we definitely flattened the curve. Like if you look,
I was looking at Our World in data this morning. I mean, the Israeli maps are just down on everything. It's quite spectacular. I don't think it's any getting away from the fact that while I admire what the New Zealanders have done.
Yeah.
They did have a slight advantage in that they arrived there very late.
Yeah.
They are a fairly big island, but a small population. But of course, they are an island.
Yeah, and we have borders. We don't, meaning we're we're surrounded, and we also have a lot of very heavy tourism industry. And at some point, I don't know how they're going to make this decision. I think there are officially still restrictions on travel coming in. I don't know when that's going to lift, but it's going to have to lift at some point. So, that's not really an option. It's not really an option for us. Yeah. So I hope we can keep it flat as possible. Absolutely.
Oh, there's a lot of people waiting to come, I'm sure. That's for sure.
For sure.
Yeah. So I know in your day job, Mali, you're a social worker, aren't you? I mean,
and a teacher, yes.
Well, what sort of... what have you observed, really? Difficulties? Improved cohesion, social difficulties, depression?
Yeah.
What's your impression?
It's a good question. I mean, there's no question that, and again, this is why I understand the need to reopen, even though, for me, it's like, let's just keep locked down, keep everybody inside, and keep everybody, corona-free. But I really do see the effects of isolation. It's really not healthy. It's not great for mental health. And it's true. I see it in clients that have, been cooped up in their houses. They've had people staying with them that were supposed to leave and are kind of stuck in their houses with them, and that creates stress. I see it with people who are living alone. I think that's really probably the hardest. I see it with grandparents who haven't seen their grandchildren. I see it with people who are ill, who can't get a lot of visitors. So, and again, like in all countries, I don't know what our data is, but suicide, domestic violence, child abuse, all of these things go up when when you have these types of lockdown situations.
Yeah, so it has caused real problems, as everywhere, really.
Yeah, so I don't know what our data is, but I can't imagine that we're immune. You know what I mean? Yeah. Nobody's immune.
Sure.
No matter, what the culture.
You mentioned the isolation there. This is probably a bit of an unfair question, but you've lived in the States. So, okay, you lived in New York, and now you've lived in Israel for 24 years.
Yeah.
Do you feel that social isolation is a bigger problem in one country than the other, or do you feel that people are more community minded in one country or another?
That's very interesting. I would definitely say Israel is a very, very community minded country. Very. So I think that, but interestingly, I think that ended up being a strength, like with the Passover description. They really figured out how to because they think community. For example, the singing on the balconies, that was happening very often here. There's a lot of volunteering. There's national service in this country. You're either there's a very strong, a lot of youth that are in national service, and so they're thinking again how to help the weak or the whatever, however you want to describe it, but more vulnerable populations. And so it's interesting. You could frame it as, because it's a community-minded culture, it would be harder for the isolation, but I don't think that's what happened. I think because it's a community-minded culture, they figured out how to maintain those social ties, because the ties were already there. The ties were strong, and so it was just a question of how do we figure this out? Do we, again, is it a lot of Zoom? There was a case of a grandson who moved in with his grandfather, meaning he decided to socially isolate with his grandfather so that his grandfather wouldn't be alone. Right. Those types of choices. Or again, I know of an elderly woman who got to the grocery store, and she was supposed to go home, and the grocery store, the guy was like, "I'm not letting you walk home by yourself." I forgot if he walked her or drove her, but because it's that type of a culture, I think that filled in the gap of that social isolation.
I see exactly the argument you're making there. There's kind of more to give up, as it were, but then that culture compensates for the necessary isolation to a greater extent.
Yeah,
that's great. Now, what's the healthcare system like in Israel?
So we have national healthcare. It's a socialized medicine system.
That's for everyone in the country.
For everyone, for every citizen, yeah.
Again, a lot of people don't realize that. I don't think so. Whether you're Arabic, whether you're Amharic, whether you're from New York,
absolutely. The truth is, one of the when you think about how we're going to promote peace in this world, I feel like one of the places that if you want to seek peaceful coexistence, is always go to the hospitals, because the same way the virus doesn't distinguish, no illness distinguishes. And so when you have people from all nationalities, dealing with the same types of troubles, visiting each other, doctors and nurses taking care of across culture, I think it does promote a very positive. I wish there were more of that. Those intercultural.
Yeah. Again, a lot of people don't realize how many casualties from the Syrian conflicts have been treated by Israeli hospitals.
There's
actually been an awful lot of trauma medicine for that conflict actually carried out in Israeli facilities. And again, Israel's been very modest about that, but it's saved a lot of lives.
Yeah, so Israel doesn't want to say it too loud because they don't want it to stop.
Indeed. Yeah. So if you're sick,
you can help people. Yeah.
No, I think we should. Yeah. If you're sick, you've got like a family doctor you can go to.
Yeah. Oh, so how does it work? Absolutely. You've got a family doctor. It's covered. Maybe there's a small amount that goes from your social. I forgot how it works from your Social Security or whatever it is. There are options if you want to pay a little bit more to get certain extras into the system, but the basic care, basically everybody's cared for, which is good.
Yeah.
And I personally, I come from the States where it's a very different culture.
I've heard a few horror stories, I'm afraid, lately from the States.
So really, I have to say that this pandemic has made me appreciate the socialized care, because there's been zero issues in terms of that. Again, the biggest complaint is, oh, I took my test on a Monday and I have to wait 5 days for the results. But we're not hearing horror stories. We're really not. And again, I don't want to make it all rosy. It's not like our hospitals need work, and it would be great if we could overhaul the system, and they're always, at full capacity. Like, I think socialized medicine has its challenges, but it shines in the fact that, nobody's left out, nobody's left behind. And so that I think we've seen also, which has been, and the care's been, my impression is the care's been good. That's my impression.
And without any racial preferences or anything.
No. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
No, that's excellent. Now, how do you see things going over the next sort of months, really? Are you getting a feeling of how this is going to pan out?
Yeah, I think we're all in that place. People who are following it closely, of like, that's the big question. Because the case numbers are rising. As of now, the critical and the serious and critical are also rising, but I don't think at the same rate, although I haven't seen a chart, but that's the feeling. And it's not clear, like, is that just lag time, because it takes a while to get to that point, or is it because we have better therapeutics? I don't know. So I think people are kind of like, and also I think the numbers are going up. So for example, camps for children that were about to open, and I had to make the decision, am I sending my daughter to this camp? I decided not to in the end. I said 400 children from all over the country. Even if they had really good rules, they're going to try to keep them in groups, and if they're larger amounts, if there are 200 of them, they'll only be outside, and they'll maintain masks, and the eating, they'll each eat from their own tray. But I said, that's just too much for me. And then it turned out that the camp wasn't even allowed to open because the Ministry of Health didn't give them permission. So, like, there's this dance between, how much do we open and how much do we close, and when are we going to put the restrictions in? And I feel like nobody's quite sure yet. That's why I feel like, again, before it was very clear. I described like a very clear. I feel like it's a lot less clear in this reopening. We also had a change in the government, so we have a new health minister. We have a new deputy health minister. So things have shifted, and I think people are watching, a kind of watchful waiting, I would say, like they're waiting and seeing. And again, you've got these two different feelings in the public. There's the feeling in the public like, oh, everything's open and I don't need to wear my mask and it's a giant party. And then there are people who are like, oh my goodness, I'm terrified. What's going to be in a week from now or 2 weeks from now?
I do think the lag times do seem to be longer than the theory would often suggest. So you might expect a lag time of a week or two, but in practice it seems that we're seeing a lag time of more like 4 weeks or 6 weeks. So I think the next few weeks are going to
exactly. So we'll find out. It's frightening. If I were in charge, which I'm not, they opened all schools at once, and then in the end the spikes ended up coming from the schools. But the argument is also that in certain schools they weren't taking precautions. So like, where was the gap there? Was it that the kids weren't wearing masks? Is it that they opened too quickly, too much? We'll all be smarter, I guess, when we can look back in hindsight and figure it out. But these are the kinds of questions people are asking. So it's like it's a more unsure time, I would say now. People aren't quite,
What is the weather like there now?
The weather's great. So this idea that weather is going to solve the problem has not borne itself out. Actually, they said that. They said we were hoping the weather gets warm here, I'd say around April, May.
I mean, what is it now? Is it about 30 or?
It's between 25 and up, I would say at this point. I don't know. Have we hit 30? 30 is pretty hot. It's a nice day today. I don't know. Today
sounds pretty pleasant to me.
Yeah, it is. It's nice. It's nice weather. It's going to get hotter. It gets very hot here in the summer, but we're not quite in the summer. Well, we kind of are, aren't we? It's July.
Early summer. Yeah. So as of now, you can kind of drive around the country and things if you want to. That's de-restricted.
You can. Yeah, you absolutely can drive around. The rules are masks in public spaces, keep your social distancing, keep 2 meters away from apart, don't forget to wash your hands. or use alcohol. That's basically.
It must be kind of nice, really, in a lot of the holy places and things without the tourists. You can.
That's interesting. That's actually interesting, and that might be. I don't know.
I mean, for locals, it must be nice and quiet. You can just.
Yeah. Although again, like I think for many locals, part of the power of a lot of these holy sites is in the power of the group. And so it kind of feels sad when things are empty. But the truth is, like, I've seen videos of people, certainly the Christian sites, and they're so full because of tourists. And it might be true that there's something nice about things being more accessible, it being easier to get in, being easier to access things. And it might be true. It might be a good time to come visit.
Yeah. How do you find children have adapted to the change? Because this is unprecedented. Well, it's unprecedented for everyone.
Yeah.
But children, I mean, is there an acceptance? Is there an anxiety? Is there? What do you think?
Question. I think kids are pretty. It's also interesting, like when you talk about culture. It's a pretty independent culture here for kids. They're not really wrapped in cotton wool, which is a kind of culture shock for people who come from America, and then Indeed. Your 14-year-old's like, bye, taking public transportation to the, or 14-year-old, maybe your 12-year-old saying that. But the advantage of that is that they are resilient. They're in that way. I feel bad for them. I feel bad for the kids, and I feel like a lot of the things that they've lost, a lot of the social things that they've lost is hard. Again, summer camps, even if they're like hiking camps,
Yeah, ours is. I normally do one in summer, and it's cancelled. Yeah.
Yeah, so those things are canceled, and like even for my daughter, I know that like the challenge of having to wear a mask or not, like they want to hug their friends. The kids, young children, and 11.
Kids are very close and tactile, aren't they? Yeah.
Very tactile age. So like the honest truth is, I think they're just not following all the rules. But the hope is if they're following enough of the rules, that's why I found that study that you had that was like, even if you do a little bit, it helps somewhat. That was reassuring, because if you're one
absolutely, anything that gets the R value down is good.
Exactly. Yeah. So with the kids, I feel like it's a balance.
Is Israel a sort of tactile culture anyway? I mean, do you shake hands? Do you hug? What's it like?
In many ways, it is a tactile culture. At the same time, in more religious communities, men and women aren't touching. So it depends on, which demographic you're talking about.
Yeah.
But it is a pretty tactile culture. It is a pretty tactile culture. But So. I don't think people are touching. I think it's more, I think people are trying to be outside, and thank goodness now you can do. Like I'm very happy that at this point, there's really no reason why you have to be inside. There's very little.
Absolutely. If you've got the good way, if you're outside, unless you're diluted, and life's good.
Right, and so I feel like a lot of stuff has been moved outside. A lot of the socializing has been moved outside, and I think that helps a lot.
Yeah.
Enables people to have social contact. So even if they're not touching, they can be communicating.
Yeah, I found that in Muslim cultures, like men will be in contact with men, but of course you never come in contact with women at all. It's
right.
Again, that's a cultural thing, isn't it?
Yeah. But the truth is here also, let's say among the ultra-Orthodox population, you might have that too. Or also, like if you have large families and you have smaller spaces to live in, there is a lot more contact, and so. But I think those communities, unfortunately, were hit harder in the beginning. So now they're more careful because they've actually experienced the negatives.
Right, that's interesting. Right, so they've actually learned from that experience. Yeah. The other thing that's interesting about Israel, well, there's many things, but there's quite a lot of science going on there, isn't there?
Yeah, it's a very high-tech nation.
So it is. I know there's Israeli vaccine programs, for example, and therapeutic programs. So.
Yeah.
Let's hope. Well, I'm sure they will come up with something. It's just a case of which ones are going to get there first and which ones are going to be most effective.
Yeah, it's true. And, as you said, there's a lot of science, and it's always a question like there was this mask that they claimed had copper in it and it stopped the virus. I haven't seen any studies on that. Like, who knows exactly? So you're shaking your head like,
but yeah.
Exactly. Or somebody had said that they had found this like breathalyzer test that Israeli had created that like within 5 minutes you would get a result, and it had 90% accuracy, which could be great at airports, but it's not like I've seen that. It looks like you see all these reports, but I don't know if I've seen it.
Yeah. The breath test, they actually started working on that back in January in Kenya. So and then they were doing some work on that in Israel, but I don't think we're there yet. But it will come. I think we'll end up with about 25 different tests for this virus, eventually. I mean, in the UK, we're working on a saliva test at the moment, for example.
That would be great.
So it will be there. Eventually you'll have a machine you go bzzz and tell you whether you've got the virus or not. But
that'd be amazing.
It's just all coming a bit slowly.
Yeah, so, some of the therapeutics they're working on, plasma treatment they did pretty early here, and identifying. I don't know if there's truth to this because I saw it in the newspaper, but like they claim to have figured out certain things about the clotting and why it's happening. I don't know if that's true. We'll wait and see.
There's quite a few studies on that. Yeah. It's just something you've said caught me there, that 14-year-olds can go off on the bus. I mean, that probably wouldn't be the state in New York, would it?
Yeah, not certain parts of New York. Absolutely.
Because, people tend to think of Israel as a sort of a dangerous society.
Right.
Because the terrorist atrocities that do occur tend to get publicity.
Right.
But day-to-day life, it's a safer society than certain others that could be mentioned.
Yeah, that's actually true in many ways, and I think that we do feel with the kids, which is kind of scary. Again, when your kid goes by, I'm going off for 3 days up north camping by the Sea of Galilee, and you're like, no, you're not, and they're like, oh, but all my friends are doing it. It's like this kind of culture shock. But again, the positive of it is it is safer than other places in many ways. Barring unfortunately, terrorism or
the unlikely event of
military issues.
So petty crime is less of an issue than in New York, for example.
I think so. I'd like to say so. It probably just depends if you're in a city, if you're in a small town.
That much. Having said, let's just make it clear. There's some fantastic. We do like New York.
Yes, Israel's great. Israel's not perfect. It's not like we're living in this little idyllic bastion of. But there are cultural differences, and you do feel it when you move from one culture to another. So I definitely do feel those things.
I can hear the complaints coming from people watching in New York already, but it's just. We're just using this as an example because it's your experience.
Yeah, I love New York. I do. I love my hometown. I love New York.
I was only there for a few days, but I loved it as well. It had a great feel to it.
Yeah.
Molly, that is just a fantastic tour de force of the influences of Israeli culture on this pandemic and other things. It's fascinating. I'm certainly going to watch it back with interest. So
I just hope it. I hope I'm really I was so proud of us. I was doing such a great job, and now I'm like, oh no. So I just hope it doesn't. I hope they get a good handle on it.
I'm giving you a so far so good.
Okay, that's reassuring.
But that doesn't. It's how things are going to pan out. There's no question there is going to be a delayed effect in new cases. It's just a case of how manageable that is.
Yeah.
And I really think this is inevitable because the vaccines realistically aren't going to be here till next year. Yeah. So this is just the new normal that we really do have to live with for the rest of 2020 and probably the first half of 2021, to be quite honest. But then the vaccine will come. I'm convinced about the vaccine coming. I think there's good reasons why the vaccine can come. A lot of people question that, and they often cite HIV, but the mutation rate in HIV is dramatically greater than it is with COVID viruses. Mm-hmm. So I'm optimistic that this time next year, life will be getting back to normal.
That would be great.
I really believe that. And it's just, we just have to go through this phase as you've illustrated and work through it together. And
I hope so.
It's great that Israel's doing that. Is there anything else you'd like to anything else you want to tell the world? There's probably about 3 or 4 people still listening at this stage.
I know this is a really long talk. I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, no, it's great. Yeah,
somebody else is.
Great. Any other key messages, do you think?
I don't know. I just think.
You'll think of something as soon as we stop recording.
No, the one thing I do think, I guess, is that it just breaks my heart to see countries in which it's become political and in which, at both extremes, it just becomes ugly on both sides, and that's just sad. It doesn't have to be like that. It doesn't.
And I'm concerned about a lot of poorer countries as well. So
yes, you always mention that, right?
Yeah, there is going to be increasing death rates, and when the health services aren't available, the 5% that are critical that can be treated in the UK or treated in Israel, then a higher proportion of those are going to die. There's no question about that.
Right. That's what I think the big fear was, right? That's what we saw in Italy when So also here they got all these ventilators. Now we don't know if we need ventilators, but I think the idea of keeping it down so you can take care of people properly is really important.
And you've probably heard news reports from Brazil, which is a major concern at the moment as well.
Yeah.
So a lot of countries are going to suffer a lot more than the UK, and the UK suffered quite badly in terms of deaths. I mean, in this country we've had, I don't know, what are we now? Well into the 40,000s, whereas Israel 307. So it's impressive. It really is quite impressive that you've.
I just hope it stays this way. I just hope.
307 deaths. It's 307 tragedies, of course, but it's still pretty. It's still pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Overall. Yeah. Right. Thank you so much. Thank you. Absolutely fascinating. I don't know how many people will watch this, but we'll certainly get some feedback. Let's hope it's positive.
Let's hope it's positive. Whenever you put, as you know, there are certain things that you put them out and you're going to get negative no matter what.
Right. So you always do. You just ignore.
So I would like, maybe my message is I'd like to give a message of peace to the world.
Absolutely.
And mutual coexistence among all people. If that's something that I'd like to say, then maybe that's a message I would like to leave people with.
You'll get no argument from this channel either on that. That's fantastic. Thank you very much, and God willing, we'll meet in.
It was an honor to speak to you. Thank you for everything you're doing. It's really appreciated by not just me, but so many people, as you can tell.
It's very kind of you, and thank you for that.
Yeah.
Cool. Right.
Yeah.
Bye, Molly. Thanks very much.
Thank you.